environment where so many people to address. So I would like to, just to give you a little example and what is the difference and what is more effective. And I know we're talking about two different universes, but it's great to learn from professionals in policy, like you are, because you are the second part, right? You have the investigators, and then you have your role, but then in organizations the same people that are investigating turn out to be the same people that have to go outside a message. So something else that I try not to take personally when people criticize the investigation. And that has taken some personal work for me, because I usually take it very personally. No, not anymore, but because we don't have two roles in my organization for that. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Olga. I'm afraid your audio was a little hard to understand or hear. I think it was just a little bit staticky. And so I think I caught some of that, but I'm not sure everyone did. A couple of the things that I heard, and you should definitely correct me if I got any of this wrong. But it sounded like, so some of the research and the work that you do.
El trabajo que hacen ustedes es
evaluating or assessing the democratic institutions and
democráticas, y como resultado eso recientemente ha generado mucho interés en los policymakers clave, que no necesariamente es la norma, pero que fue capaz de darles algo de acceso, y eso es bastante interesante, que hacen investigación y análisis que de manera directa habla de los fundamentales, o sea, temas fundamentales del gobierno, de alguna institución o cuerpo gubernamental, y que crean un interés natural, de repente no de forma, digamos, buena. Algunas personas no toman bien la crítica, pero tal vez no es algo que todos quieran escuchar, pero está muy bueno que hubo un interés en ese trabajo. Pero suena que están llegando a muchos partidos políticos. Yo no tengo mucha experiencia, como le digo, con muchos partidos políticos. Para mí me parece que cada vez que ustedes o nosotros y nuestros colegas que producen un reporte de investigación, el siguiente paso es ver qué van a sacar como los hallazgos principales, qué van a resaltar para cada público distinto. Y creo que no marcaría que uno nada más está eligiendo algunas cosas, pero uno puede tener diferentes cosas que se lleva de un reporte. Entonces uno puede más o menos pensar que la forma en que lo resalta o que lo comparte en los medios puede cambiar un poco, puede ser diferente a quién llegas, de la manera en que lo comunicas. Entonces de repente a veces hay que enfatizar más unas cosas, otras. Nosotros lo hemos hecho también antes para algunas coberturas de prensa. Un colega mío, por ejemplo, escribió un reporte bastante grande, un informe grande que revisaba de temas de estreses por deudas a nivel global, países que tienen estrés por las deudas del país y retos que les puede traer estos niveles de deuda muy grandes, ¿no? Por ejemplo, relacionados al financiamiento que reciben de China, y tratar de entender esa dinámica. Por ejemplo, qué países podrían estar enfrentando problemas potenciales de deudas, ¿no?, debido a este financiamiento chino. El informe hablaba del panorama general y el mensaje fue que de repente no es algo que se esparce muchísimo, pero puede ser un problema aislado en algunos lugares, pero de pronto se vieron 8 países, y no es que sea realmente solo 8 países que tengan este tipo de estrés, pero bueno, se colocó el encabezado como 8 países con estrés de deuda. Entonces era como que, ¿qué estás tratando de enfatizar, no? ¿Qué estás tratando de enmarcar? ¿A quién estás tratando de llegar? También hemos también llegado a una idea de cambiar un poco tratar de hacer que la asistencia internacional también, la idea llegue a otros países para que también salga de otros países. Entonces, algunas de las cosas que hicimos nada más era hacer llegar los resultados que queríamos, que se sepa un poco también una pieza de propiedad, que de pronto un país hable también un poco más de qué fue lo que hizo, también los beneficios y enfatizarlos de manera más, con más fuerza, ¿no? Si estoy buscando, por ejemplo, un público más conservador, podría enfatizar que bajo un acuerdo como esto estaríamos pagando solo por los resultados que se logran. No, entonces, un tema de la efectividad y la eficiencia, ¿no? Ese sería el argumento, en lugar de enfatizar si estoy, por ejemplo, tratando de llegar a un público más progresivo. En los Estados Unidos podría enfatizar la idea de que esta pieza de propiedad, que es importante que no dictemos cada elemento de un plan, porque dentro del contexto del país van a entender mejor los obstáculos que están enfrentando y cómo van a poder llegar a los resultados que se están buscando. Entonces, pensar un poco en cuál es el público efectivo, identificar si es que hay formas particulares de llegar a ellos en base a lo que han creado, ¿no? Obviamente no va a funcionar para todos los tipos de investigación, pero son algunos ejemplos de mi experiencia.
Hola, hola a todos, qué gusto verles. Yo tengo una pregunta
Hola, qué gusto verles.
y la voy a hacer en español, ya que tenemos a Daniela que se la puede pasar mejor que yo a Erin, así que y así los demás entendemos todos. Eh, no estoy seguro si es que esto estaba dentro de los temas que tú sugeriste al inicio, pero por tu experiencia me gustaría mucho eh, conocer tu opinión sobre cómo podemos nosotros identificar la influencia o el poder en un mapeo quizá de los actores o de los diseñadores de política pública con los que tenemos que interactuar, porque sabemos que el hecho de tener una determinada posición en la institución que sea, no necesariamente coincide con el nivel de influencia, aun cuando en términos formales parezca que es así. ¿Cómo podemos nosotros identificar elementos que nos ayuden a realizar este tipo de mapeo para las actividades de incidencia en nuestras organizaciones? Erin, you're in mute.
Thought I unmuted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. So, I don't know that I have a great answer for you, but I think it's a really important point in terms of thinking about, if you're trying to identify who you need to reach to make a change or to get something shifted, there are going to be people who sort of actually maybe have lines of authority or have titles that would suggest that they're the people you want to try to reach, but there may be other people who are actually in fact more powerful, or getting to that person, there might be people along the way who are quite useful. So I think sort of a stakeholder mapping exercise can absolutely be really useful. In terms of filling in that information, I think it probably depends a lot on the context. In the US, I think, some of that you can glean from, tracking media pretty closely and kind of getting a sense of who's being referenced in regards to different policy ideas. Who are that, in the US, like who are they sending on these trips, or who seems to be at the table when they're making decisions? And the other, the other place that I find this to be really useful if you don't have the direct relationships is kind of where like allies come in. So if you have a network of like-minded organizations and maybe this would actually be something that they would be interested too, is actually like gathering a few people informally to sit down and talk about, where are the levers of power, who are the messengers that might be able to reach them, which kinds of constituencies would they be likely to respond to, and then how could we sort of harness those to reach the people we need to. But if others have ideas, I'm happy to have others chime in too. I don't know if that was terribly satisfying.
Maybe I can share some ideas, and I can take an example that we deployed through Mexico and US in order to have a much of sense of what you are doing. Something that, and some advice that maybe I can share is to take the pulse of the political moment, of the political context. Because if we have a think tank that, for example, is specialized in digital growth and digital transformation and acceleration to vitalize growth in our economies, like the example that I'm going to share with you, is that if we have a very strong research and we are working on that research with very strong highlights, insights that really can take the control of the political moment, is very useful. For example, and I will share an experience that we had in a private think tank regarding digital transformation. We had a very strong research about how digital transformation can vitalize growth in the Mexican economy. And at the moment that Trump started to talk about the wall, it was a very tense relationship between US and Mexico. And we take advantage of that political context, that political moment that allow us to launch our research with the focus on how this wall can be a really digital wall if we in the Mexican market we do not take advantage of technology as a key enabler of growth. So we launched a book that
Oops. All right, well, I think we got the gist of that. That was a really interesting example too. The idea of using something timely and in the news and of interest and of the moment, and using that to help sort of, again, another sort of messaging framing piece, but this idea of finding something that is of great interest within sort of the halls of government, and then trying to harness that to put your research on their agenda. I think that sounds like a great idea, and we've certainly done things that are maybe somewhat similar to that. Did others want to come in? I know there are a couple sort of unmuted briefly, but. Oh, and Maria Fernanda, you're back. You'd frozen. Yes. Did you want to finish your thought there?
Yes, I fall down with the net. So we launched the digital wall as a book, and it's a good experience that also Erin shared, that we frame the research with this moment, this political momentum. And we tried not to get a political a political side specifically, but we open a dialogue, not just with the stakeholders around digital transformation that were involved, but especially in the opinion leaders. We tried to really make a heads up about that, that let us position the digitalization of the economy as the best way how to really do not allow to build a commercial and an economic wall, okay? So we switch and reframe the context and the momentum in the political side to really bring the conversation locally in Mexico that allow us to really focus on digitalization in order to avoid the wall that US wanted to set in the agenda of between the both countries.
Great, and I think now my internet's giving me a hard time, but thank you. That's a great example. Yeah, did others want to jump in and share something? David, are you unmuted there?
Sí, bueno, hola Erin, un gusto a todos, todas. Yo tengo más que todo una pregunta. Por lo menos cuando los problemas son muy complejos, no dependen de un solo actor. En el caso de CIEDU hacemos investigación en materia educativa y muchas de nuestras investigaciones inclusive han sido titulares de periódico, llegan a medios de comunicación, pero de ahí a la toma de decisiones hay una distancia. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿cómo medir el impacto que se tienen en las publicaciones y demás cuando la solución a los problemas no depende de un solo actor? Entonces, es decir, dentro de todos los actores que se participan, al momento de nosotros de rendir cuentas como organización, ¿cómo podemos medir más, de manera más específica? Un caso que tenemos es el retorno a clases. Nosotros vemos investigación educativa. El retorno a clases había sido, Panamá es uno de los países que más ha demorado su reingreso a clase. Nosotros sacamos mucha investigación, hicimos posiciones, pero al final es una decisión pública de parte del gobierno, pero nosotros todavía nos queda como intangible cómo medir nuestro aporte o cuál ha sido nuestra influencia en los medios de comunicación para esa decisión. Entonces, es una pregunta abierta para todos en materia académica, cómo medir ese impacto que se hace, ya sea a través de medios de comunicación, directamente a las tomas de decisiones, cuando uno es parte de un grupo y no se puede, como decir, esto sucedió por mi esfuerzo, ¿no? En temas como calidad educativa, en temas como salud pública, depende constantemente de muchos actores y no solamente de uno. Entonces, ¿cómo medir ese impacto dentro de una colectividad de actores?
Yeah, that's another great question. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I think for researchers, there's a tendency to really want to be able to measure that attribution really specifically. And that's just not always possible, I think, in these circumstances. And I mean, my experience is that there are almost always a multitude of actors in making any policy change come to fruition. I think it's quite rare if you are the one change agent in making something happen. So I think that is sort of the reality. For us, we do track all of the media mentions, all of the headlines, all of the op-eds. We track also things like downloads of publications, which, as you pointed out, are just the inputs. They're not showing or demonstrating your impact. I think then anything you can track as far as meetings or positive citations of your work, or really any citations of your work and research. Sometimes having a very specific headline or some sort of branding can help. I talked about this, I think, a little bit in the video that I did. But where you can sort of have a phrase or something that captures the main points of your work, then it can be easy to identify or watch that if it does sort of gain traction, if people cite it or use it. My colleagues have been looking at gender and COVID and sort of thinking about the recovery and termed this phrase cash, care, and data to sort of capture their 3 message points. And then Melinda Gates of the Gates Foundation went up on a stage and said, cash, care, and data. And we were like, that was us. So, it can make it easier to track something if you've got, some sort of specific phrase or a few points that you really try to hit. But I think in the end, for us at least, it is about tracking all of these very small things. And then, at the end of the day, trying to pull that together in a narrative that shows that, you were in these discussions, that your work was out there, and that you were at least part of a group. But I don't think anyone expects a think tank to be the only one. So it is, to me at least, about, telling that story about, how you were part of a process, even if it's not, we had this exact role and, 10% of this change was attributed to us, because that just probably is impossible to assess. But being able to tell a good story with some of the numbers in terms of media citations and meetings and all of those things to back it up, I think can still be quite compelling. And it looks like Gabrielle, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Erin. Voy a hablar en español para que Daniela pueda traducirlo al inglés. Mi pregunta era específicamente, por ejemplo, con las comunidades de práctica. Digamos, sabemos de que muchas veces muchas organizaciones tienen estas mesas, o que tal vez no necesariamente sean comunidades de práctica, pero sí grupos en los que trabajan algunos temas en específico, y en contextos latinoamericanos y específicamente contextos como el de Guatemala, muchas veces también, digamos, el gobierno es muy frontal, o las autoridades encargadas del diseño de políticas son muy frontales con las organizaciones a la hora de poder hacer críticas, o sabemos de que las organizaciones hacen ciertos pronunciamientos en contra de algunos de sus actuales. Y, digamos, cómo mantener también la relación tanto con estas comunidades de práctica o grupos a la hora de ir y sentarse con el gobierno para presentarle los resultados de una investigación, sobre todo, digamos, porque sabemos que al final, si queremos influir dentro del diseño de políticas, hay que sentarse con personas que están en el gobierno, y creo que, digamos, tal vez ustedes también durante la presidencia de Trump tuvieron tal vez muchas buenas experiencias por el hecho de que era un gobierno muy frontal con las organizaciones, muy poco receptivo hacia recomendaciones. Entonces, creo que tal vez si nos pudieras compartir un poco de cómo lograron toda esta parte, algunas buenas prácticas, algún caso que hayan tenido en específico, y que, digamos, tampoco hayan dañado su relación con otras organizaciones en las cuales estaban trabajando en conjunto, y que tal vez, digamos, se podría entender como un tipo de traición hacia la postura que estaban teniendo, ¿no? Gracias.
Yeah, fair enough. That's an interesting one. So I think, I'm trying to think if I have a good example here. I mean, so we are part of a network, which I think you could probably call a community of practice to some extent. It is kind of a mix of different organizations. It's some implementing organizations, it's some sort of more in the advocacy space. And I think it's we're sort of the one think tank that's part of it. But there's some other individuals who participate, and it's really focused on issues of aid effectiveness. And so we come together regularly to discuss issues and share information, but I think we've also been able to serve as kind of a platform for government to engage with the sort of aid effectiveness community. And I guess I would say maybe a couple of things, specifically sort of under the Trump administration. I think, one was that even though the president himself had fairly strong and was quite strong views about foreign aid and was quite vocal about that, you know, when you went down a couple of levels to some of the people who were really operating in these agencies, they didn't necessarily share exactly his views. I think they were more supportive. And so, you know, it was still quite possible to have meaningful conversations with many of those actors, sort of in spite of the rhetoric and things that we might have heard from the highest levels. There were definitely moments, obviously, when the administration sort of called out specific actors, including some that were sort of in our space in a negative way. I think the power of the sort of network idea is that it dilutes that a little bit. You know, if you've got one organization that maybe has been called out in a negative way, but you know, you've got a whole network of actors, they may not pay that much attention to the fact that there's, you know, one organization that's part of a much broader network that maybe they feel less favorably disposed towards. Again, I think some of this was the oftentimes I felt like the rhetoric was more heated externally than it really manifested in the actions of the government. So, so it wasn't, you know, they weren't necessarily, even if they were saying, you know, the president was saying things that were, you know, quite negative, that didn't necessarily translate exactly into the actions taken by the agency. And so we were still able to sort of operate with this network. I don't think it was the case that there were times when, you know, actors couldn't be involved in those conversations or something. It didn't ever come to that specifically. So I guess I don't know that I felt we had to navigate that per se. I think, you know, that said, if you've got a pretty diverse network, there obviously may be actors, or a diverse community of practice, there may be actors who are more aligned or better positioned to communicate with a certain group or party. And so using them to facilitate connections can also be helpful. So, you know, even where, you know, for our network, for instance, like, you know, we have both, we have members who have served in, you know, both Republican and Democratic administrations. So depending on their connections, we might deploy them to try to request a meeting for the whole group, to sort of make use of that diversity and try to bring everyone together. But I think it was also the case that, you know, particularly early on, when there were these big proposed cuts to foreign aid and some other ideas about, you know, sort of transitioning countries away from aid. And what initially had sounded like it could be a pretty quick move, potentially closing USAID missions and things. There was kind of an outcry from the community. And I think the administration also responded to that. So they felt like they needed to be more proactive in engaging with the community so that they didn't have to deal with that sort of backlash. So I think that also made them more willing to come to the table to talk about things, because they sort of saw that if they didn't, they might, you know, get this, you know, sort of negative reaction where the media and things picked up on these criticisms. And so it was sort of easier for them to actually like try to sit down and talk through things rather than just face all of the criticism. Again, that was more at the agency level than the White House, but that's sort of where we ended up. But I don't know if others have experiences with this too, or might want to jump in here. Maybe not.
Bueno, quizá aprovechando que Gabriel pues es de Guatemala, mi nombre es Gabriela Hierro, yo también soy de Guatemala, de otra organización, y un poco ampliando lo que él estaba mencionando, digamos, nosotros como organización recibimos únicamente fondos de cooperación internacional. Justamente USAID, Unión Europea y algunas otras agencias de cooperación que ellos miden sus resultados con base a indicadores de impacto, ¿verdad? Entonces, muchas veces también nosotros hemos sentido el riesgo de dejar de recibir fondos de cooperación precisamente porque gobiernos como Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, no puede llegar a tener negociaciones con el país, con el gobierno de Guatemala, entonces ahí automáticamente se reduce la cooperación para nosotros. Tuvimos también el ejemplo con Alemania, que tampoco llegó a tener esos acuerdos con el gobierno y se redujo muchísimo los fondos para el país y automáticamente reducen nosotros el financiamiento, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿cómo lograr identificar cuáles serían los indicadores en esos contextos, ¿verdad? Los indicadores o qué debiéramos de identificar nosotros como indicador de impacto para una investigación, ¿verdad? Para una investigación sin necesidad de tener esos acuerdos con gobierno y lograr al final dar un resultado al que nos está financiando. Sé que es una pregunta difícil, pero...
Yeah, I was just gonna say, no, it's a really interesting one though. And it's a good point in the sense that we hadn't even brought up the idea of like, oh, if your funding is quite directly tied to your ability to operate and how much that can be then in jeopardy depending on what is happening in a political climate that you really don't have much control over, obviously. Like some of these big things, your ability to have impact is influenced by things outside of your control, which feels, I'm sure, very unfair and really is in a lot of ways. I think we probably have a somewhat different experience. We do get some funding from foreign governments. We actually don't take US money. This is mostly like European donors or Canada and Australia. But a lot of our funding also comes from foundations who also want to see impact. But I think the ones that we've worked with have tended to be a bit more understanding about the specific indicators. I think our deliverables tend to be reports and meetings and those kinds of things, as opposed to the sort of final impact, although they want us to talk about why we did or didn't get there. I think at least a few of them that we've worked with have been really good about sort of pushing for candor in that regard and being kind of open and honest about, why we did achieve something or, what the challenges were or why we didn't and what some of the big obstacles were and what we maybe learned from that experience. And that also extends to sort of being upfront about what we see as those potential risks. So, in looking at our US development policy program heading into the 2020 election, it's like, well, things could go, we could continue to have an administration that doesn't really like multilateral cooperation for the most part, that is generally very restrictive when it comes to migration policies. Or we could have a shift, and we don't know exactly what that would look like either. We're only just now, I think, getting a taste of that because there was a shift in the administration. But trying to sort of lay out like, okay, these are the factors that are outside of our control, and how that might influence the work. I don't know whether that will satisfy your funders in terms of a willingness to be somewhat flexible about the indicators. Because I know there is that desire for metrics, but thinking about, if there is a change or if something happens in relations, sort of outlining that to begin with might be helpful. And whether it's in your dialogue with them or if you're able to in sort of grant agreements to say, these things are dependent on these other things. We're going to do these convenings, but this assumes this scenario. Because I think at least then you sort of are all on the same page and they're not surprised if all of a sudden, something doesn't come to fruition or isn't realized because of political circumstances, if you sort of set up front, you know, here are some of the things that could stand in our way, and maybe try to have that conversation first, then maybe you can find some more flexibility. But obviously that is going to depend on who you're working with. Jessica, were you trying to come in here? Or does anyone have better insight for Gabriela? What was a good question if a hard one? Does anyone else have to deal with that same circumstance where they feel like they're really their funding is very much tied to things that are largely outside of their control?
I think that if you see in advance that a situation or some initiative is depending upon factors that you can't actually control or handle, maybe that's simply not the project in which you want to involve as an organization, right? And it's important to try to identify these issues before actually agreeing with the funder. And on the other hand, maybe it is helpful to reach some general agreements in certain points where situations can change without, and you can do nothing about it. So you have like enough freedom to move or to shift your direction, your objectives, and still like accomplishing or the indicador. I don't know how the word how to say it in English, but you understand, like. So you can, you won't have problems with the one that's funding you because the indicator is so general that you can still like accomplish your objectives.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I think, Jonathan, did you want to come in?
Sí, muchas gracias. Buenos días y gracias por la conversación. También nosotros trabajamos desde Guatemala, pero trabajamos con cooperantes en toda Centroamérica. Y un poco sobre lo que decía Gabriel, efectivamente hay cooperantes que desean que un centro de pensamiento tenga dentro de sus metas el que cambien leyes o se aprueben nuevas leyes, y eso es prácticamente imposible. Mucho más en un contexto poco democrático, en donde se aprueban leyes por intereses particulares para quienes están ostentando el poder. Nosotros hemos desarrollado una tabla de capacidades de incidencia y a cada proyecto le asignamos un nivel de incidencia. Hay proyectos que tienen el nivel 1, que es simple y sencillamente poner los temas en la discusión pública. El nivel 2, que es lograr que con el proyecto se pueda acercar a diferentes actores que toman decisiones, que son grupos de presión. El nivel 3, que es la propuesta, es decir, que nuestro instituto tenga la capacidad de proponer un cambio frente a un problema. Y el nivel 4, que no depende de nosotros, que es efectivamente que se den los cambios. Pero para eso tendríamos que ser ministros y tener 150 diputados en el Congreso de Guatemala. Entonces, ese nivel de incidencia 4 no depende de nosotros, sino que efectivamente depende de diversos actores y de un contexto favorable. Eso nos ha permitido que cuando se nos evalúa, no se pretende evaluar como si fuéramos un congresista que está empujando una ley y que tiene poder para empujarlo desde dentro. Y sobre el segundo tema, que quería comentarles es un poco sobre la necesidad que hemos tenido de buscar financiamiento afuera de Centroamérica, porque sí notamos que en contextos de mayor autoritarismo, los gobiernos se están acercando a los cooperantes y les están diciendo, mire, si quiere seguir en buena relación con nosotros, no le tiene que dar dinero a estas organizaciones con las cuales nosotros no compartimos las ideas. Nos lo han dicho algunos cooperantes que han tenido esa presión, ministros, viceministros que piden reuniones con ellos para decirles que hay que asfixiar financieramente a las instituciones que piensan distinto a ellos. Eso nos ha hecho que salgamos a Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, a buscar apoyo de otras fundaciones e incluso que hayamos presentado estudios, por ejemplo, de corrupción, que son los que molestan a los gobernantes, los hemos presentado en Washington en lugar de presentarlos en Guatemala o en El Salvador. Pero entonces sí creo que el contexto de mayor autoritarismo nos obliga a salir y encontrar otras plazas en donde también hablar y comunicar, pero también buscar recursos. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jonathan. Those are both great points. And I think we're going to get cut off in just a minute, but I think the idea that you shared with Gabriela about this sort of like having some benchmarks along the way. So you make sure you're getting credit for progress towards ultimate impact, given how difficult impact really could be. And then the idea of finding alternate audiences, which I think, yeah, is just, it makes sense that that's the reality of the situation you're in. And I think, you know, certainly in the US, I could see where that would be of great interest to US policymaking audiences as well. And also, I don't know if you've explored foundations, but something like the Hewlett Foundation actually is very keen on sort of these ideas around evidence-based policymaking in countries and are trying to support organizations and think tanks that I think to build that up. So yeah, I think that certainly sounds like the right strategy given where you are.